All right, open your Bibles with me. We're starting a new book today, the book of Judges, and I have a word for you if you don't know this. Oh, hey, good morning, good morning. How are you? Good to see you. The book of Judges. I've told you this fellow before. He's amazing. He's been in this church all 30 years I've been here. But for many years, I just saw him in the halls. He was born deaf, so he doesn't hear at all and therefore cannot speak. Has never heard a human voice. But I would see him and he might wave a little and that was it. But then he started bringing a note to me, often in the library where I'd be gathering with the prayers, and he writes very well, and he would write down almost always some catastrophe, an earthquake, a volcano, a tornado or something, and he would write tornado in Mississippi or flood in Nashville or something, and then he would often draw little teardrops. And he would do like this, that he was sad, and I would nod, yes, I'm sad too. And then one Sunday, a year or so ago maybe, after all these years, I don't know, he brought me some little note, something terrible had happened that he had seen on the news, and he can read the closed captioning. So he had seen this on the news and he was sad. He'd drawn little teardrops. And I don't know, I just hugged him. I just reached out and hugged him. And ever since then, he comes looking for me. Every Sunday, if he catches me before Sunday school, he hugs me in the hall. If not, he just comes in here. So once we have a little hug, then he's good and I'm good, and he moves on. He's wonderful, and I appreciate him so much. All right, a word for you. If you don't know this word, I want you to know this word. It's a Greek word. It comes from Greek. It's English now, of course, but it comes from the Greek. It was a word that they had in their vocabulary, amphictyoni. Amphictyoni. Any of you history majors, sociology majors who know this word? Do you? Okay. This word is a word that describes a loose confederation of tribes. Okay? A loose confederation of tribes who have something in common, but are afraid of one tribe perhaps being stronger or more powerful than the others. It's not surprising, is it, that people who had lived under the harsh domination of a king, and of course Pharaoh is just the Egyptian word for king, but they had been under the harsh domination of a king for 400 years. Think about how long that is. Our country is just a little over 200 years old. 400 years they had lived under the harsh domination of a king. And so they were frightened to death of kings. Even though the tribes they were going to confront as they crossed the Jordan River, almost all of them had kings. They had tribal kings. They didn't rule over huge territories, just small ones. But the Israelites were scared to death of kings. They got over that in 200 years. But it would take them 200 years before they would decide, we need a king like everybody else. We'll come to that later. But for now, when they crossed the Jordan River into the Promised Land, their understanding was, this wasn't a word they would have known, but they would be an amphictyoni. 12 tribes, descendants of the 12 sons of Jacob. Jacob, of course, had lived about 500 years before their crossing the Jordan this time. So 500 years later, thereabouts, they are going to live as an amphictyoni, a loose confederation of tribes who will come together when they have a common enemy. And the person who would lead them in those terrible times came to be known as a judge. So the book of Judges is about some of those outstanding people whom God lifted up to lead one or more tribes together against a common enemy. That's what this book is going to be about. And you'll know a lot of these names, of course. Even if you didn't go through the whole Bible with us before, you will know many of these prominent names. You may not have known they were called judges, but they were. Samson, you know the Samson stories, and Gideon and Jephthah and Deborah and so on. These are judges, and we're going to now read about some of them as we move into this book of Judges. Let's pray. God, thank you for this book of yours. We know it is your book. You saw to its being written, and you have seen to its preservation, and you continue to call women and men to spend their adult lifetimes studying this book, always looking for some new insight, something we've not seen or understood before, some insight into you, who you are, what you expect of us, how you initiate right relationship with us, and if we appropriately respond, we can know ourselves rightly related to you in faith and rightly related to each other in self-giving love. Bless our time together this morning and help us understand these things about you that are forever true. In Christ's name, amen. All right, I'm just going to read highlights, but last night as I was looking over my lesson, I think there are quite a few highlights here, things that you might want to know. And I don't want to skip things that are important. I don't want to deal with things that are not so important. I'm doing the best I can. Let's start with chapter 1. Now, after the death of Joshua, let's try to get this sort of in our minds as to history here. Most scholars believe that this exodus out of Egypt would have occurred about 1200 before the Common Era. Okay, so remember we talked about how you can sort of divide Israel's history into 200, 400, 200, 400. Okay, so we had 200 years roughly of the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph. Okay, and then, so 200 years of them, then 400 years of slavery. Now we'll have 200 years of this Amphictyony. And then we'll have 400 years of kings. And then the last of those kings is destroyed after 400 years in 587, 586 with the coming of the Babylonians. And no Jewish king, no descendant of David sat on the throne again. Okay. I mean, Herod the Great, those who were kings in New Testament times, were not descendants of David. Right. So 200, 400, 200, 400. That'll help you just a little bit. So we're at about 1200 when these events are taking place. After the death of Joshua, and then it's going to mention a few chapters later, Joshua died, so they keep sort of retelling here. Remember that first these stories were told around campfires. There's a long oral tradition in Israelite history. And the best scholarship, even today, with all of the great libraries now being linked with internet and so on, we have no reference of any Jewish or Israelite writing before the time of King David. Nothing. So before that time, we believe it was an oral history. So if you're telling stories around a campfire to people who neither read nor write, you have to keep saying things over and over so that they remember. All right, so after the death of Joshua, the Israelites inquired of the Lord. And Lord, remember, if you're new with us, let me just tell you, the Lord, in good translations like the New Revised Standard Version, is very consistent in translating the name given to Moses at the burning bush. God translates the even older name they had for God, El, or Elohim. Lord translates the Eye Asher Eye, I am who I am. All right. He inquired of the I am who I am, sometimes shortened to Yahweh, as you know, who shall go up first for us against the Canaanites to fight against them? Now, let me remind you that Canaanite was sort of a generic term that encompassed a lot of different tribes. Okay. There was not one tribe known as Canaanites, but rather the inhabitants of the Promised Land. So later we're going to read about various individual tribes within the group. But Canaanite sort of is a generic term that encompasses all of them. All right. So what we're dealing with here are the peoples who live in the Promised Land. The Israelites certainly settled down into the Negev desert as well, but largely circumscribed here by the Dead Sea and the Mediterranean, and then up to the Sea of Galilee and the Jordan River. Okay, these peoples, but a number of different tribal groups under one sort of generic name. So Yahweh said, Judah shall go up. I hereby give the land into his hand. Judah said to his brother Simeon, Come up with me into the territory allotted to me, that we may fight against the Canaanites. Then I too will go with you into the territory allotted to you. So Simeon went with him. Then Judah went up, and Yahweh gave the Canaanites and the Perizzites into their hand. They defeated 10,000 of them at Bezek. So these numbers can seem huge to you and me. There may be some exaggeration in an oral history. The fish gets bigger and bigger the more times you talk about catching it, you understand. Let's go on to verse 8, because what I simply want to give you here at the very beginning of the book is the understanding. They do have some victories, but they don't come close to driving out all the indigenous people. They will have to contend with them for centuries, even to today, of course. Still, the war goes on between the Jews and others who live in the Promised Land. Look at verse 8. Then the people of Judah fought against Jerusalem. This was a very small little settlement at this time on a hill called Mount Zion and ruled over by a group called the Jebusites. They put it to the sword and set the city on fire. Afterward, the people of Judah went down to fight against the Canaanites who lived in the hill country, in the Negev, and in the lowland. Judah went against the Canaanites who lived in Hebron. All right, let me remind you here, this is encompassing a lot of territory. The Negev is sometimes spelled with a B, sometimes with a V, but it's here, south and west of the Dead Sea. The lowlands are along the sea, the Mediterranean. The lowlands also are along the river, but usually they're talking about the lowlands as being along the sea. And right down through the middle of this area, you have hills. Not the Rockies, not the Alps, but significant hills. I've told you Jericho is more than 1,500 feet below sea level. It's only 50 miles here from the Mediterranean to the Jordan. But in 50 miles, one goes from sea level to 1,500 feet below sea level. But to do that, you have to go through a ridge of hills. And Jerusalem is up in the hills about 3,700 feet high. Okay, so from the Mediterranean to Jerusalem, you're going up 3,700 feet. 17-mile road down to Jericho, very crooked but big, modern, beautiful highway now. You go down the 17 miles, you've descended a mile from Jerusalem down to Jericho. Okay, so lowlands are usually along the sea. The hill country right down through sort of a backbone here of the whole territory. And then the Negev, of course, is desert. Really desert country. Okay, let's skip on to verse 18. Judah took Gaza. I wanted you to see this, to see that territory, of course, still exists right along the Mediterranean. The Palestinians have control of Gaza today. Judah took Gaza with its territory. Now, I want you to notice three names here. And you may not remember them, but just to be aware of them, because we will revisit them. You have Gaza, Ashkelon, and Ekron. Samson will be one of the judges who has to deal with those cities. And 200 years after the events we're reading about here, David will have to contend with them all over again. So Ashkelon and Ekron in the territory of Gaza, they will have to deal with over and over. Yahweh was with Judah, and he took possession of the hill country. Okay, that sort of the backbone right down through the center there, but could not drive out the inhabitants of the plain because they had chariots of iron. very important. The Israelites do not have iron. And anyone who does has a decided advantage over them. And people who've heard chariots say that they make a gosh-awful noise coming down the road. And if you have 50 of them, or 100 of them, or 200 or 300 of them, it's really, really frightening if you do not have them. It would almost be today one group having tanks and the other group just having infantrymen, running before the tanks. Almost that severe a difference. Look at verse 21. The Benjaminites, remember Benjamin was the second son of Rachel. Her first was Joseph. She died giving birth to Benjamin. She was buried at a little place called Bethlehem. At Bethlehem. So the Benjaminites, descendants of that favored son of Jacob, did not drive out the Jebusites who lived in Jerusalem, even though it's already told you they killed a bunch of them, set fire to the city. They were not able to displace these Jebusites. So, notice here, the Jebusites have lived in Jerusalem among the Benjaminites to this day. So again, these stories are looking back. They're looking back a long time and saying, we tried to dislodge them, but we were not successful, and we've had to share this territory with them up to this day. So not at the time of the judges, but at the time, finally, this is being committed to writing after being an oral tradition for a long time. Look at verse 27, just to give you a little feel for this. Manasseh, one of the other tribes, did not drive out the inhabitants of Bethshean and its villages. I want you to note Bethshean. If we get to go to Israel in February, whoever wants to make that trip, one of the really significant digs in Israel today is Bethshean. Really is spectacular. I mean, for digs, when you see what they have at Jericho, you will think, is that all? When you see Bethshean, you'll be more impressed. It's more like Ephesus, the ruins at Ephesus, than others. The first time Gail and I went to Israel was in 1983. At that time, our guide said to us, you see the trapezoidal shapes out there, and you can see them on the landscape. Trapezoid, you remember? Parallel on two sides, not parallel on the others. So flat, virtually on the top, and then two sides moving away from each other. They know these are ancient inhabitants that gradually got covered over with dust and then grass and so on. Well, after 1983, when more and more Jews were being allowed to leave the old Soviet Union, and then after the dissolution of the Soviet Union even more, many of them were musicians. And they didn't need more violin players in Israel, so they decided to put a bunch of these violin players on that hill out there with shovels and several very good archaeologists and have them start digging. And what they unearthed was Bethshean. And here it is mentioned as far back as roughly 1200, before the Common Era. You and I will visit it again in Scripture. 200 years later, when Saul is king, he's still battling against the Canaanites, and they chase him down and his army, and Saul is killed, and all of his sons are killed. Saul's body, his son Jonathan's body, nailed to the wall at Bethshean. And here we have the ruins. We have the ruins. 3,200 years after they're mentioned here, and 3,000 years after Saul and Jonathan are nailed to the wall. Now, the ruins, of course, that have been unearthed depict Bethshean after the Romans controlled the territory. And we know the Romans have been there dramatically because they built a main street like they always did when they took a city. And in Latin they called it the Cardia, the heart of the city. And in the heart of the city they put beautiful marble columns. Okay. not native to Israel. They had to be imported. So these marble columns are floated over on ships and barges and set up in Bet Shean. So from 1983, when it was just a trapezoidal shape, and we haven't been now in 13 years. It would be 14 by the time we get to February if we get to go. So we haven't been since 1997. And so I don't know what it looks like 14 years later. But in 1997, I know what it looked like by that time. And every time we had been since 1983, more and more had been set back up so that you could sort of see what Bet Shean looked like. Okay, so I just mentioned it here that they were not able to drive out the inhabitants of Bet Shean. Oh, by the way, it's over nearer the Jordan River here. It's not in Gaza. It's over much nearer the Jordan, in the lowlands, not up in the hill country. Look at the latter part of verse 27. Last few words. The Canaanites continued to live in that land. When Israel grew strong, they put the Canaanites to forced labor and made slaves out of the ones they could, but did not, in fact, drive them out. So this storyteller is being very honest here. They tried to drive out the inhabitants. They were not successful. In most cases, not successful. They would have to contend with these tribal groups for centuries. Let's go to chapter 2. Now the angel of Yahweh went up from Gilgal. Gilgal is again another ancient settlement right near the Jordan River, to Bochim, and said, I brought you up from Egypt and brought you into the land that I had promised to your ancestors. I said, I will never break my covenant with you. For your part, do not make a covenant with the inhabitants of this land. Tear down their altars. But you have not obeyed my command. See what you have done? So now I say, I will not drive them out before you, but they shall become adversaries to you, and their Elohim shall be a snare to you. When the angel of Yahweh spoke these words to all the Israelites, the people lifted up their voices and wept. So they named that place Bochim, and there they sacrificed to the Lord. Okay, let me stop, and I'll probably tell you this any number of times again, but let me just remind you that James Missioner tells this part of their history really well in the source. What did the Israelites find as they came out of the desert? Okay, all scholars are agreed that whether they spent most of the 40 years here or most of the 40 years there, that eventually they did in fact enter from the east, moving westward, came across the river at Jericho. And when they crossed the river and got into the hill country, guess what they found? Beautiful temples on the tallest hills. Beautiful temples on the tallest hills. When one goes into Europe, every little town put its walled portion of the city, the palace, on one high hill and the church on the other. The castle and the church on the highest hills. Now, what was going on at those temples? The ancient gods and goddesses, Baal. You were probably taught Baal when you were a child, but scholars now know it was a two-syllable word, Baal, and his consort, his primary one, was Astarte. Baal and Astarte, which were considered the god and goddess of fertility. Now remember that Israel, in the hill country, gets pretty good rain for about 5 months. And then no rain for 7 months. 2 very distinct seasons. And by the way, in February, I'm hoping it will be nice and cool. It may also be wet. I'll remind you, we need to take umbrellas and things. Maybe wet in February, because that is during their rainy season. But I can assure you, wet and cool is better than 110 and sun. I've been there in June. I'll take wet and cool in February. So what they found was all these stories about Baal and Astarte. They believed that in the summer the gods went to sleep. And they slept all summer. While it was hot and muggy, they slept. And then in the fall, they had big ceremonies. Like, I've told you the Jews had something entirely different at Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. For the Jews, it was a time of introspection, of confession, of repentance, and God's setting them right again with Him, forgiving them, setting them right, sending them into a new year. But the pagans had a rip-snorting big party, and a part of that, too much wine, too much food, too much sex, was to wake up Baal and Astarte. And they knew they had wakened them when they would hear thunder. The rainy season had come back. So you'd been successful. You had awakened the gods, and they were stomping around in heaven, and the rains would start. The other thing, of course, it seemed to work. Every fall it would rain. The other thing, of course, was that the Canaanites, to make this really attractive, got some of their longest-legged gals, the really pretty ones who looked nice with very little clothing, and had them do exotic dances in their temples. And finally it had gotten to the point, to inspire the gods and goddesses of fertility, so that all cows have calves and all ewes have lambs and all of our wives have babies, you're really doing a service by having sex and intercourse with these temple prostitutes. That's what the Israelites tried to sell to their wives. I'm really doing a great thing here when I climb up the hill at night and cavort with the prostitutes and excite Baal and Astarte so that they stomp around and it rains and so on. That's what they're up against. So they did not tear down the temples at the top of the hills. They didn't tear down the altars to these pagan gods. And the one true God is not happy. Is not happy about that. Okay, let's look at verse 8. We're at chapter 2 still, verse 8. So once again, we're told, Joshua, son of Nun, servant of Yahweh, died at the age of 110 years. Now, we were told that in the book of Joshua. Now we've already been told twice that he's died. Again, here in Judges. Look at verse 10. Moreover, that whole generation, Joshua's generation, was gathered to their ancestors, and another generation grew up after them who did not know Yahweh or the work that He had done for Israel. We're losing what Tom Brokaw has called America's greatest generation, the World War II generation. These thousands, hundreds of thousands of American soldiers who fought a war not so they could rape and plunder, but could free people who had been enslaved by the Nazi regime in Germany. Who, when they liberated a town, a village, a city, they passed out candy bars. Did not rape the women in the streets and force them into slavery back in the United States. Tom Brokaw in his interviews said many of these veterans never discussed things that had happened to them during the war. They got back home, they went to college on the GI Bill, they went to work, and they made a life. A good life for a spouse and children. Worked hard all their lives. We know from records in the Methodist churches that the early 1950s were the heyday. Everybody in America almost was going to Sunday school and church, every week. Every week. Polls done today show that the younger generations today think if they go to church once a month or once every 6 weeks, they're active. They count themselves active. One major study done by the Lilly Foundation, they've done a lot of religious work, and the Lilly Foundation decided to pick out a particular Presbyterian church in Indiana Go back to the confirmation class of 40 years ago when these youngsters were 12 and see what's happened to them since then. They found that virtually none of them attended church more than Christmas and Easter. If asked, where would you have your mother's funeral if she were to die? Well, at the Presbyterian church. Where would you have your daughter's wedding when she gets married? At the Presbyterian church. But they went twice a year. It's hard to build a church out of folks who come twice a year, even once a month or once every 6 weeks. How can you build a choir out of folks that show up once a month or once every 6 weeks? Dr. Kroll is working so hard right now in a new young adult Sunday school class. And he taught them himself for several months and finally got them up to 6. And when he started having others come and teach them, last Sunday they had 3. You can't get them all there the same Sunday. If they had 12 of them, they could count on each other week after week. They could build a class. But these 3 show up one Sunday, and those 3 another Sunday, and those 3 the third Sunday, and the other 3 the fourth Sunday, and you have 3, not 12. You understand? Every generation is this close from not being the church, not being that voice we need desperately in the world. God's voice. Not God's perfect voice, but God's voice nonetheless. This isn't something new. I mean, Rabbi Sherman grieves about this, Rabbi Fitzerman grieves about this, and we Christian preachers grieve about this, that the next generation is always a new challenge, an entirely new challenge. Let's go to verse 11. So, if you have a whole new generation who do not know the works of the Lord, all you have to do is read a survey done by Gallup or somebody else. The average American cannot name the 4 Gospels. Does not know if Psalms is in the Old Testament or the New. Doesn't know whether Moses is in the Old Testament or the New. Whether he's one of the 12 disciples or not. When you don't know a few basic things, guess what? Church is not having any real effect in the community. So, then the Israelites did what was evil in the sight of Yahweh and worshipped the Baals. They abandoned Yahweh, the Elohim of their ancestors, who had brought them out of the land of Egypt. They followed other Elohim from among the Elohim of the peoples who were all around them. They hadn't been able to dislodge them, and bowed down to them. They provoked Yahweh to anger. They abandoned Yahweh and worshipped Baal and the Astartes. So the anger of Yahweh was kindled against Israel. See, again, it's fire in the nose, so the word kindle is used. Fire is burning in God's nose. And he gave them over to plunderers who plundered them, and he sold them into the power of their enemies all around, so that they could no longer withstand their enemies. Whenever they marched out, the hand of Yahweh was against them, to bring misfortune, as Yahweh had warned them and sworn to them, and they were in great distress. Then Yahweh raised up judges. See? Raised up judges who delivered them out of the power of those who plundered them. Yet they did not listen even to their judges, for they lusted after other Elohim and bowed down to them. They soon turned aside from the way in which their ancestors had walked, who had obeyed the commandments of Yahweh. They did not follow their example. Whenever Yahweh raised up judges for them, Yahweh was with the judge, and he delivered them from the hand of their enemies all the days of that judge. For Yahweh would be moved to pity by their groaning because of those who persecuted and oppressed them. But whenever the judge died, they would relapse and behave worse than their ancestors, following other Elohim, worshiping them, bowing down to them. They would not drop any of their practices or their stubborn ways. So the anger of Yahweh was kindled against Israel. And he said, because this people have transgressed my covenant that I commanded their ancestors and have not obeyed my voice, I will no longer drive out before them any of the nations that Joshua left when he died. in order to test Israel, whether or not they would take care to walk in the way of Yahweh as their ancestors did. The Lord had left these nations, not driving them out at once, and had not handed them over to Joshua. Okay, so you see the cycle here. They turn from the commandments of God. They worship the gods and goddesses of fertility, and God backs away. Lets them be plundered by their enemies. When finally they cry out to the Lord, He's moved to pity. He sends a judge to pull the Amphictyoni together. As long as that judge is still around, they may do well. When he or she dies, they go back to their old ways. And the cycle starts all over again. That's what the storyteller is trying to tell you. It starts all over again. All right, let's go to one of the judges. May not know this one as well. Chapter 3, verse 12. The Israelites again did what was evil in the sight of Yahweh, and Yahweh strengthened King Eglon of Moab against Israel, because they, the Israelites he means, had done what was evil in the sight of Yahweh. Okay, let me remind you where the Moabites lived. We know. 200 years from this happening, one of the Israelite families will be caught in a famine when it's not raining and they can grow no grain. And so they cross over the Jordan near Jericho into the land of Moab, right here. Okay, just north and east of the Dead Sea, just east of the river. A mother and father, two sons. Two sons marry Moabite women. Father dies, two sons die. Mother decides she'll go home again, tells the two young women, I have no other sons for you. Go back to your people. One says, okay. The other one says, no, I'm going with you. Ruth and Naomi. Moabites lived right here. But this is a time when the Moabites are not going to give up their territory. They want to expand into this territory. They make life miserable for these Israelites, and God finally hears their cry and decides to lift up a judge. And this judge's name is Ehud. E-H-U-D. Ehud. Verse 14. The Israelites served King Eglon of Moab 18 years. 18 long years before God decides to intervene. But when the Israelites had finally had enough of that and cried out to Yahweh, Yahweh raised up for them a deliverer, Ehud, son of Gera, the Benjaminite. Okay, we know which tribe. The last one born to Rachel of two. Ehud, a left-handed man. Now, that's significant in the telling of the story. Because most people are right-handed. And the king to whom he's going to bring a gift is watching the right hand and takes his eye off the left hand. The left hand. So that's how this plot's going to unfold. It's very important that he's a left-handed man. The Israelites, okay, they've been under Moabite control for 18 years. They have to pay taxes or tribute. So they sent tribute by this man, Ehud, to King Eglon of Moab. But before he went, Ehud made for himself a sword with two edges, sharpened both sides. Not only that, he made it shorter than usual, about a cubit long. How long is a cubit? Tip of the elbow to the end of the longest finger, about 18 inches. 18 inches, the sword would strap right to the right leg and could be worn under the clothes. Okay? He made himself a shorter than usual sword, sharpened it on both sides, and straps it to his right thigh. Fastened it on his right thigh under his clothes. Then he presented the tribute to King Eglon of Moab. Now Eglon was a very fat man. When Ehud had finished presenting the tribute, he sent the people who carried the tribute on their way. Some had assisted him. We don't know what the gift was, how big, but several had brought it along. And once it's presented, Ehud says, "Okay, you can go away now." But he himself turned back at the sculptured stones near Gilgal. So he's gone back away himself. Gilgal is across the river from Moab. So he himself turned back and said, "Oh, I have a secret message for you, O king." So the king said, "Silence." And all his attendants went out from his presence. He wants to hear the secret message. Ehud came to him while he was sitting alone in his cool roof chamber. Okay, stop and think. It's hot in the Middle East. It's really hot. And even the smallest of houses often had a flat roof. They didn't know how to pitch them very well. They were flat, poles across the top, and then often with thatch, branches, sticks, limbs, and mud sometimes. But people slept up on the roof so that if there was any breeze moving from the Mediterranean to the desert or back again, you could sleep fairly comfortably. So the old king is there. And again, Ehud says, "I have a message from Elohim for you." So he rose from his seat. Then Ehud reached with his left hand, took the sword from his right thigh, and thrust it into Eglon's belly. The hilt also went in after the blade. This was quite a punch. The hilt went in after the blade, and the fat of this king closed over the blade. For Eglud did not draw the sword out of his belly, and the dirt came out, not the sword. So Ehud went out into the vestibule, closed the doors of the roof chamber behind him, and locked them. After he had gone, the servants came. When they saw that the doors of the roof chamber were locked, they thought, "He must be relieving himself in the cool chamber." So they waited until they were embarrassed by not being there to attend. When he still did not open the doors of the roof chamber, they took the key and opened them, and there was their lord lying dead on the floor. Ehud escaped while they delayed and passed beyond the sculptured stones and escaped to Seirah. When he arrived, he sounded the trumpet. Now, trumpet, don't think of as a metal horn like Louis Armstrong. It's a ram's horn. It's a shofar. He sounded the shofar in the hill country of Ephraim, one of the 12 tribes, and the Israelites went down with him from the hill country, having him at their head. He said to them, "Follow after me, for Yahweh has given your enemies, the Moabites, into your hand." So they went down after him and seized the fords of the Jordan against the Moabites and allowed no one to cross over. At that time they killed about 10,000 of the Moabites, all strong, able-bodied men. No one escaped. So Moab was subdued that day under the hand of Israel, and the land had rest 80 years. Okay? So, enslaved, in many ways, at least oppressed, for 18 years, then a judge, then 80 years of peace for those tribes. It's not talking about all 12 of them yet. Let's go to chapter 4. The cycle will repeat. The Israelites again did what was evil in the sight of Yahweh after Ehud died. See, they got one righteous soul who's doing right things, but when he dies, everybody forgets. So Yahweh sold them into the hand of King Jabin of Canaan, who reigned in Hazor. Okay, we know about ruins of Hazor, as we do about the other cities I mentioned to you. I told you those Canaanite cities we would revisit in the time of David. In the time of Samson even, we will revisit them. Samson is blinded and taken to one of them. So, King Jabin of Canaan, who reigned in Hazor, the commander of his army was Sisera, who lived in Harosheth Hagoyim. Then the Israelites cried out to Yahweh for help, for he had 900 chariots of iron, and had oppressed the Israelites cruelly 20 years. Okay. So it takes them a while to finally decide that they themselves cannot rescue themselves, and to remember, oh wait, there's a God who cares about us. Why don't we ask him for help? Now at that time, Deborah, a prophetess, wife of Lapidoth, was judging Israel. All right, so here we have a woman judge. You know that name. And often liturgically, now in our prayers, some of the newer ones being written, where there was a time when I was a younger minister that all the liturgical prayers in the book of worship was God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Joseph. Well, now those prayers say God of Jacob and they say of Abraham and Sarah, of Isaac and Rebekah, Jacob, and so on. It gives the wives as well. And they often mention Deborah in that list, God of Deborah. She used to sit under the palm of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim, again one of the 12 tribes, and the Israelites came up to her for judgment. Means she listened carefully and decided things. Who's right, who's wrong. She sent and summoned Barak, son of Benoam, from Kadesh in Naphtali, another one of the 12 tribes, and said to him, Yahweh, Elohim of Israel, commands you, go, take position at Mount Tabor, bringing 10,000 from the tribe of Naphtali and the tribe of Zebulun, 2 of the 12. I will draw out Sisera, the general of Jabin's army, to meet you by the Wadi Kishon with his chariots and his troops, and I will give him into your hand. Remember what a wadi is. Here in Oklahoma, you might call them a gulch, an arroyo, or something. In the dry season, nothing. In the wet season, they would often flow like a rushing, gushing stream. In Colorado, in the hill country of Texas, can be very dry. And if a sudden little storm hits, the water comes down the hills and gathers very quickly. So a wadi could run full in the rainy season and be bone dry in the dry season. Okay, David will later meet Goliath down at the bottom of 2 hills in a wadi, as it was. So she's talking about that kind of place. So Barak responds to her, if you will go with me. He perceives Deborah as a person who knows God, knows God's will. If you'll go with me, I'll go. But if you will not go with me, I'll not go. And she said, I will surely go with you. Nevertheless, the road on which you are going will not lead to your glory, for Yahweh will sell Sisera into the hand of a woman. But it's not Deborah. It's not Deborah. It's another woman you recall. Skip to verse 13. Sisera called out all his chariots, 900 chariots of iron, and all the troops who were with him. Look at verse 14. Then Deborah said to Barak, up! This is the day on which Yahweh has given Sisera into your hand. Yahweh is indeed going out before you. So Barak believes, and those who are fighting with him believe. So Barak went down from Mount Tabor. He plunges down into this wadi with 10,000 warriors. They don't have 900 chariots, but they got a lot of manpower here. And the Lord, Yahweh, threw Sisera and all his chariots and all his army into a panic before Barak. Sisera got down from his chariot and fled away on foot. Verse 17. Now Sisera had fled away on foot to the tent of Jael, wife of Heber and Kenite. And one of our trips to Israel, our guide was named Jael. You can see, it's a good strong name. A woman who saved her people. And we had a guide who had that name 3,000 years later. For there was peace between King Jabin of Hazor and the clan of Heber, the Kenite. Jael came out to meet Sisera. He's running away from this battlefield. He's abandoned his chariot and said to him, turn aside, my lord, turn aside to me, have no fear. So he turned aside to her into the tent, and she covered him with a rug. She's hiding him. Then he said to her, "Please give me a little water to drink, for I'm thirsty." So she opened a skin of milk and gave him a drink and covered him again. He said to her, "Stand at the entrance of the tent, and if anybody comes and asks you, 'Is anyone here?' say no." But while he's all covered up there, Jael, wife of Heber, took a tent peg, took a hammer in her hand, and went softly to him and drove the peg into his temple until it went down into the ground. A straight pass through. He was lying fast asleep from weariness, and he died. Then as Barak came in pursuit of Sisera, Jael went out to meet him and said to him, "Come, I will show you the man whom you are seeking." So he went into her tent, and there was Sisera lying dead with a tent peg in his temple. We had a guide named Jael. I kept my eye on her the whole time. Didn't want any tent pegs through the temple, that's for sure. Let's go to chapter 6. Now, at your leisure, you may want to read chapter 5. It's a very old poem. It's very, very old. The Song of Deborah, this judge who decided right and wrong between members of one of the 12 tribes, and who bolstered up Barak and sent him into battle, and of course achieved victory. But we've read this poem before, and I don't see any great significance here for you and me, except for you to know that this is very old Israelite poetry. Chapter 6. Guess what happens? The Israelites did what was evil in the sight of Yahweh, and Yahweh gave them into the hand of Midian 7 years. So we've had Moabites, you see, for 18 years, and then this group for 20, and now another group, 7. Not always the same tribes, different tribes among the 12. The hand of Midian prevailed over Israel. Now the Midianites we know lived down in the south. In fact, you remember Moses' father-in-law is called a Midianite. Remember? Yep. His father-in-law was called a Midianite. I lost my place. Verse 3. Whenever the Israelites put seed into the ground, the Midianites and the Amalekites and people of the east would come up against them. They would encamp against them and destroy the produce of the land as far as the neighborhood of Gaza, that's right over on the Mediterranean, and leave no sustenance in Israel, no sheep or ox or donkey. They took everything. For they and their livestock would come up. They would even bring their tents thick as locusts. Neither they nor their camels could be counted. There were so many of them. So they wasted the land as they came in. Thus Israel was greatly impoverished because of Midian. And finally, the Israelites cried out to Yahweh for help. Verse 11. Now the angel of Yahweh came and sat under the oak at Ophrah, which belonged to Joash the Abizarite, as his son Gideon was beating out wheat in the winepress to hide it from the Midianites. Okay. We know what a winepress was. A big stone that was turned and the grapes squeezed for the juice to run out at the bottom. But he's working there around the winepress, trying to keep the enemies from seeing that he has wheat, and that, of course, can be used to make bread. The angel of Yahweh appeared to him and said to him, "Yahweh is with you, you mighty warrior." And Gideon is thinking, I'm a farmer. And God is seeing him as a warrior. Gideon answered him, "But sir, if Yahweh is with us, why then has all this happened to us? I mean, we haven't seen much sign that Yahweh is on our side. Where are all his wonderful deeds that our ancestors recounted to us, saying, 'Did not Yahweh bring us up from Egypt?' But now Yahweh has cast us off and given us into the hand of Midian." Then Yahweh turned to him and said, go in this might of yours and deliver Israel from the hand of Midian, I hereby commission you." He sees God's really serious now. So he responded, "But sir, how can I deliver Israel? My clan is the weakest in Manasseh." Okay, Manasseh is one of the 12. So in my tribe, my own little group is the weakest of them all, and I'm the least in my family. But Yahweh said to him, "But I will be with you, and you shall strike down the Midianites, every one of them." Then he said to him, Gideon, "If now I have found favor with you, then show me a sign that it is you who speak with me." So Gideon went into his house and prepared a kid, young goat, unleavened cakes from an ephah of flour. The meat he put in a basket, the broth he put in a pot, and brought them to him under the oak and presented them. The angel of Elohim said to him, "Take the meat and the unleavened cakes and put them on this rock and pour out the broth." And he did so. Then the angel of Yahweh reached out the tip of the staff that was in his hand and touched the meat and the unleavened cakes, and fire sprang up from the rock and consumed the meat and the unleavened cakes, and the angel of Yahweh vanished from his sight. Then Gideon perceived that it was the angel of Yahweh, and Gideon said, "Help me, Yahweh Elohim, for I have seen the angel of Yahweh face to face." But Yahweh said to him, "Shalom Alechem, do not fear, you shall not die." Remember, in Israel, nobody sees the Lord and lives. Verse 25. That night Yahweh said to him, "Take your father's bull, the second bull, 7 years old, pull down the altar of Baal that belongs to your father. Cut down the sacred pole that is beside it." The sacred poles were phallic symbols, of the male sex organ, you see, whether it was human or whether it was cattle or sheep, goats. It was a sign of fertility. Tear down the altar, pull down the pole. Build an altar to Yahweh, your Elohim, on top of the strong hill hold here, in proper order. Then take the second bull that belongs to your father, offer it as a burnt offering with the wood of the sacred pole that you shall cut down. Take that wood and make sacrifice to the real God. So Gideon took 10 of his servants and did as Yahweh had told him. But because he was too afraid of his family and the townspeople to do it by day, he did it by night. Now when the townspeople rose early in the morning, the altar of Baal was broken down, and the sacred pole beside it was cut down, and the second bull was offered on the altar that had been built. So they said to one another, "Who's done this?" After searching and inquiring, they were told, somebody tells, "Gideon, son of Joash, did it." Then the townspeople said to Joash, the father, "Bring out your son so that he may die, for he's pulled down the altar of Baal and cut down the sacred pole beside it." But Joash said to all who were arrayed against him, "Will you contend for Baal? Will you defend his cause? Whoever contends for him shall be put to death by morning. If he is an Elohim, this Baal, let him contend for himself, because it's his altar that's been pulled down." Verse 34. The Spirit of Yahweh took possession of Gideon, and he sounded the shofar, and the Abiezrites were called out to follow him. He sent messengers throughout all Manasseh. Remember, Manasseh is his larger tribe. He has a small family group, but this is one of the 12. Sent them throughout all Manasseh, and they too were called out to follow him. He also sent messengers to Asher, Zebulun, and Naphtali, 3 other tribes, and they went up to meet them. We're going to have to stop there. So you understand, an Amphictyoni, in this case, it starts with one little family group, expands to a tribe. Now they've involved 3 others. So 4 of the 12 are going to be involved in this battle. Let's see, we need to stop at 6:36. 6:36. And next week will be the 16th. If you haven't been to church, don't rush off. We have handbells and choirs and all kinds of good things.